Louis Burtone rode through the barely stable archway of his holdfast. The rain still hammering down in sheets, pinging against his old armor. From the autumn gloom and dying light of the day, he saw a lantern approach him.
Agatha!
He yelled over the storm.
Get back inside, you're gonna catch your death out here in this cold.
Still the lantern came nearer. Agatha approached and took the reins of his horse in her old and leathery hand.
Not proper for you to have to stable your own horse after being gone all day,
the old croon declared. Louis grunted, unable to muster the guts to argue with the old woman.
One day I'll have me a servant that listens,
he said, dismounting. Agatha, never one to let the last word go, replied.
Aye, when I'm dead and gone, perhaps.
Louis snickered under his bent and dented helm.
Have it your way, old bones. He's got hay aplenty. Just get him in and get yourself in.
He left the stubborn hag to her chore. His steel boots were sucked into the mud of his meager courtyard with every step. His joints ached in protest as he strained just to make it inside. After what seemed like an eternity in the mud, he made it inside. He had to push hard against the wooden door to stop it against the vicious wind blowing. With the door closed and now in the relative warmth of his home, he collapsed on a small bench opposite his armor rack. He always dreaded this part.
Guile! You there, boy?
He called out for his grandson. He heard the footfalls running down the stairs.
Here, Papa!
The little boy cried out. Guile ran into his arms at full tilt.
Oh!
Louis chuckled and grunted.
Easy, lad, I'm old. About did me in with that mighty charge. Help your grandsire out of his armor, won't ye?
The boy was all smiles as he began undoing buckles and straps. Louis groaned with relief at every piece of armor that came off. His grandson was too young, too naive to realize how old and unimpressive his grandsire's armor was. Louis was grateful for that. It would soon change, though. The boy would get older, wiser. Then he'd realize what a mediocre and inadequate man he came from. Then the resentment would come. But not today. Louis had recovered some strength from the warmth inside and began helping his grandson with removing his armor.
What all did you get into today,
he asked. Guile looked straight into the old helm.
I took Charles hunting, shot a rabbit, and 2 squirrels.
The young boy exclaimed. Louis smiled as he took off his bucket and gave it to Guile. The boy had to stand on the balls of his toes to place it on top of the armor rack.
3 bagged in a day? Not shabby, lad. More impressive still, you got that old hound off his ass to do something,
Louis said, referring to his old hound that rarely left the dining room fireplace. Guile shrugged.
He wasn't much help, just barked real loud like and scared off some of the critters.
Louis chuckled a little too hard at that, and his ribs pained him.
Aye, that's about all he's good for.
His beaten breastplate came loose and fell face first on the wooden floor. There had been a time in his life when he had never let that happen. Any knight worth his salt wouldn't let his sigil go face down. He'd seen Arthur O'Frey lose his mind over less on those poor boys in training. He was old, though. He hadn't had to endure the insane tutelage of Lighthammer. Perhaps he would have been a better man if he had, but those days were so far away now. He picked up the steel and hung it on the armor rack. His old eyes fixated on it for a moment. The red stallion on a field of yellow. It had seen far better days. The paint was thin everywhere. In some spots it was chipped or wiped away entirely. The steel beneath was dented and scored with slashes. His armorer had died 4 years back and he hadn't a coin to hire a new one. Tomorrow morning he'd try and work some of the dents out. He was far from a proper smith, but he did what he could. Guile would get a kick out of it at least, he thought. He wiped the mud and dirt off the plate. The blood, though, he'd have to wash that off in the morning. He caught Guile staring at it with him.
What you do today, Papa? Did you have any great adventures?
Instantly his mind went back to the 3 bandits he discovered outside Kranich. To the poor girl they nabbed. She was barely older than Guile. They had already taken what they wanted from her by the time he had found her. It was all the old knight could do to best them. 3 paltry roadmen, he thought, disgusted with himself. Had been a time long ago when he could have killed those 3 in his sleep. But the passage of time was cruel. Everything living was eventually stripped down by time, but to a man, to a warrior, it was especially cruel. He turned his dim eyes to Guile and did his best to smile.
I cut down a pack of horned men,
He lied. Guile lit up like a candle.
All by yourself?
He practically yelled. Louis nodded, and Guile gasped in amazement. The boy exclaimed,
You must be the bravest and strongest knight ever.
Louis couldn't stomach lying to the boy anymore tonight.
Go wash the dirt off and get on up to bed, Guile.
The little boy yawned and protested as every young one does. He watched as the little one slowly dragged himself up the old stairs. At the halfway point he turned and wiped the sleepiness from his eyes.
Will we play tomorrow, Papa?
Louis stood, kicking off his boots.
I will find something to get into, I swear it. Now off you go, rascal.
The boy smiled and took himself to his bedchamber, what used to be his father's when he was a boy. Someday he'll know the truth, the old knight thought. What a sad day that will be. He told Guy that his father had died a noble death at the Battle of Far Harbor Glade. In truth, he turned rogue and set up a company of cutthroats. Louis had done his duty to House Payne and the people of Aurelia. He stripped off his wet clothes on the way to the dining room. By the time he made it, he was down only to his pants. He grabbed a fistful of simple cloth evening wear that he left lying around and donned it. He laid out his wet clothes and let them dry by the fire that his dinner was simmering over. It was incredibly uncouth to do so, but who would see? No one. He was an old man now, sitting in a windy, creaky holdfast. There was no company coming, no one to be aghast at his clothes drying on the floor. It was trouble enough summoning the will just to rise in the morning and put his feet on the floor. His wet rags could fuck off for all he cared. He leaned over the pot above the fire.
Ah, Agatha, you've outdone yourself,
he said to himself. The game Guile had bagged with Charles was simmering with potatoes, carrots, and onions. He looked at Charles's usual spot and found it strangely empty. It struck queer the fat old hound wasn't laying on his blankets waiting impatiently for his share of supper. Before he could linger on the thought, he heard Agatha rap gently on the door.
Yes, Agatha?
He inquired. The old woman sounded as tired as he was.
Supper there is ready, and I know your old eyes can't hardly see. The bread is in that bowl behind you. There's a spoon to the right of it. If you don't need anything else, I'll be retiring for the evening.
Louis nodded, his thin grey beard brushing his chest, but he thought of something. He grabbed the arms of his chair and turned his body so he could see her.
Bard? Has he been back in?
He could barely see Agatha at this distance, but she appeared to scratch her chin in thought.
If he's back in, I haven't seen hide nor hair of the man. You know how he is, though. If he spotted some big game, he'll be gone another day or two yet.
Louis accepted the answer and shooed the old crow off to bed. His huntsman was the only other retainer he had. Louis spent most of his days in the saddle, patrolling the roads, occasionally killing roadmen. His only other time was spent trying to mend his holdfast or drawing his grandson. Bard kept a larder filled with meat. Louis simply had not the time nor the eyes for hunting. He poured himself some of the small game stew in a bowl with the bread in it. The bread was a day old and stale, perfect for stew. Even the simple act of eating his dinner pained him. Fingers, wrists, forearms, elbows, and shoulders had all been tormented in his life of service. The cooking fire cast a warm glow over him, and his eyes traced every scar along his arms, remembering every blow that had put them there, or most of them anyway. His fading memory was the one blessing getting old had given him. As he neared finishing off his stew, he put the bowl down. The dredging up of past battles pushed his need for drink upon him. He sighed in resentment as he got up and went to fetch some. He knew he was well and truly hooked. If he wasn't, he wouldn't have gotten out of his chair and demanded more work from his torn and old joints. His wine cellar, if it could be called that, was cold and damp. Too much weight on these loose stones, he thought. His pitiful wine rack had only 3 bottles in it. Each one he had bought in happier, wealthier times. Each one had been purchased for celebrations of days that had never come. He ran a fat, scarred finger along them. Not tonight, he mused. He went to the large barrel he'd purchased at Stormgate 2 months prior and opened the spigot, filling his decanter. He didn't know what this wine was called, and he didn't care. It was cheap and came by the barrel, and it did the job. He took a swig for the return journey to his chair. As he corked the decanter, the oddity of Charles's absence bothered him again. The hound loved booze as much as he never missed a chance to follow him down here for a drink. What had Giles said? Charles had been barking in the woods. The old lout couldn't be bothered to bark. He was a coward. An army of Uruks could be storming the keep and Charles would have hid under a bed without so much as a whimper. Gods be fucked, it's been an awful day and I just wanted to drink some damn wine, the old knight bitched to himself. Now he was worried, paranoid. Maybe the old dog had gone to bed with Guile. Yes, that was it. Old Charles was tired of sleeping on his blankets on the floor. His knees bemoaned their lot in life as he trudged up the stairs. He had not remembered it being so cold up here. Perhaps the chill of the cellar was still clinging to him. No, even standing in the hall adjacent to the dining room, he could see the fire was dimmer. He shivered uncontrollably. Fuck me, it's freezing in here, he thought. He took a deep breath in and blew it out, his breath steaming. His skin crawled with fear. His old age and broken body threatened to rob him of his courage. But Guile was here. The old man mustered what courage he could. He could barely see in this new gloom, but he knew his sword belt was by the armor rack. He slowly made his way to it, past the dining room where the door was cracked open. Someone was in there, he knew it. He retrieved his sword. It was a simple blade, castle-forged steel, a rough leather wrap for grip. Its only unique feature was the Payne's lion crest in the pommel, and a single small ruby in the hilt. It was still sharp though, and it would do the trick. He unsheathed the blade and stood before the dining room door. He hadn't prayed in years, but he offered one now to whomever was listening. Before he could storm the door, a silk-laden voice called out, "Enter!" Louis was stunned. He kept a tight grip on his sword and gently opened the door. Where he had previously sat, there now was another. His dim eyes couldn't make him out well, but he appeared to be a large, muscular man draped in a bull's skin. Louis stepped closer when the voice called out again.
"This is your home, Sir Louis. Please, have a seat."
Louis's mind ran hard thinking of what to do. He wanted to lunge and drive his sword into this foul invader, but in his eyes he couldn't judge the distance. A beautiful hunting lance hung behind the man, above the fireplace which now flickered, slowly dying out. The wedding gift from the rodents would give him reach, but he doubted he could reach it. The stranger's voice took on a harsh tone.
"Have a seat, sir."
Louis decided it best to bide his time, and sat in the chair closest to the uninvited guest. Now that he was closer, he could see something wasn't right with the man. His bull pelt was massive, yet even it could not hide the grotesque musculature threatening to rip out of his skin. The pelt he wore was uncured, as if he had slaughtered the creature and simply donned the skin fresh from its previous owner. It reeked of blood and rot. The stranger was leaned over, eating the stew Louis had not finished. At this angle, the boar's dead eyes were pointed at Louis, the left one practically staring into him. He tilted the bowl back and drained it, wiping his mouth with his arm.
I cannot taste anything that touches my lips, but I have yet my sense of smell. It had a lovely aroma, and I'm sure the taste matched it. My compliments to your chef.
And he pointed up with a single finger. Louis followed where he pointed. The dying fire offered little light, but he could see the dark stain forming on the wood above them. Saturated with blood, the wood let go of a few small drops that landed where the two sat. Louis wiped up a drop with his finger.
You killed her,
he stated, matter-of-fact-like. The stranger leaned back in Louis's chair and nodded slowly.
I did. I took no pleasure in it, and she was asleep when I struck her.
Louis glared at the interloper.
An old woman asleep in her bed. Truly a terrible foe.
Beneath the boar's hood, an inhuman grin spread across his features.
You have me there, sir. Hardly fair game, but that huntsman of yours. Now that was thrilling.
The creature rolled something from under the table with his foot and gently kicked it to Louis. The old knight looked down at his feet and saw Bard's lifeless eyes staring up at him. In his heart, in his gut, in the soul he drowned in cheap wine and stew, he was sickened. Bard had hardly been a friend, but he was a good lad, always true to his word and honest. The man offered his services fairly and kept to himself. Louis always felt Bard had been trying to escape something, but he never pressed the young man about it. Louis eyed the hunting lance again. He couldn't see it, but he knew there was a crossbow with a few bolts resting in the corner by the fireplace. The murderer spoke once more in that sickly, sweet, gentle voice.
I was once in your place. Don't try it. I have no desire to kill you just yet.
Louis sighed and put his sword on the table.
Then what shall it be? Chess? Cards? Shall I fetch more wine? You not being able to taste will avail you of the swill I keep.
At this, the killer laughed.
I didn't know I could still do that,
he said, his voice laced with the sadness that shocked Louis. He picked up the spoon Louis had used earlier and twirled it in his massive fingers.
The huntsman gave me something to think on. I sought out to kill you, and I shall, but at first, I had planned on butchering you in your sleep. Yet,
he paused, seemingly lost in thought.
Yet?
Louis offered. The killer put the spoon down.
Yet the huntsman gave me pause. He was wily, that fellow. He figured out I was stalking him. Led me on quite the chase. He was good. Maybe not as good as I was in life, but a damn fine hunter regardless. He used every trick of our trade. He covered his scent, doubled back over a stream, then double backed again, even led me into an ambush. The strangest thing occurred to me over the course of our game of cat and mouse. Do you know what that was, sir?
Louis shrugged.
I've no inkling.
A thin smile etched over thinner skin gleamed beneath the boar's head hood.
He was leading me away from you.
He pointed at Louis. He continued.
The man didn't know I was already aware of your association. He thought by leading me away you could ensure your safety. That it was him I was after, and that by putting distance between myself and your home he could ensure your safety.
He leaned on the table, his oversized arms and chest making the sturdy wood groan beneath his weight.
The question I found myself asking, of course, was why? Why would this man die for you? When our chase came to its natural conclusion, I put the question to him. Sir Louis, do you know what he said?
Louis could feel his anger burning, threatening to overpower his senses. Stone-faced, he shook his head no. Now the stranger pulled back on the bloody boar's head hanging over him and revealed his face. It was the most horrifying thing Louis had ever seen. His skin was stretched thin and tight over his features. It was a mottled pink and purple, almost like a corpse. His lips were near non-existent, and when he smiled, fangs mingled among human teeth, and they gleamed bone white. The worst, though, were his eyes, or lack of. Where a man's eyes should have been, there were two bottomless pools of black as ink. The lidless, pitiless pools stared at him, and he felt his hair go white. Teeth and fangs gleaming white, he said.
Bard told me.
And then his voice changed entirely. It was as if Bard himself was talking to him. First came two wet, rattling coughs from the blood-soaked throat of a dying man.
The people need him.
He threw his head back and laughed aloud.
Isn't that the damnedest? The people need him.
At that, they both laughed. Both mocking the sentiment. Louis tried to keep his voice from shaking.
I'm the only knight near Crannig, unfortunate for them. I suppose they do need me.
Louis admitted. The monster nodded in mocking agreement, still grinning.
Yes, they do. They do need you, sir.
Then his smile vanished in an instant.
As my wife needed you, she needed you desperately when the hornmen tore her limb from limb.
For a moment, Louis felt his fear melt into guilt. He did not know of who he spoke specifically, because so many had been butchered by those foul creatures. The great holds and keeps that hosted armies were all at least a full day away from Crannig. It was just him out here, a fair amount of country for a lone knight to cover. Louis cleared his throat.
I'm sorry for your loss, truly I am. I cannot bring her back to you, but I have gold and silver, hidden in a trunk. It's yours, all of it.
The monster gave a disappointed sigh and leaned back in Louis's chair, his mask threatening to break its wooden frame. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion.
No, don't do that. Don't try to plead for your life. You're a knight. An old, fat, lonely knight, but still. It would be more dignified of you to admit to your predicament. Or has age robbed you of your last vestiges of dignity?
Louis tried to match the thing's tone.
I barter not for my life, but for my grandson's. My life is forfeit. I know this. Take your justice from my corpse and be on your way.
At this, the creature was outraged.
Justice,
he hissed. He spoke through clenched tooth and fang.
Justice would be if I went upstairs and flayed flesh from bone from that runt.
Louis erupted out of his chair, his hand snatching his blade from the table and leveling it at the monster's throat. His eyes filled with fire and resolve.
I'll carve your wretched heart from your chest, beast!
He spat. The man-thing's expression softened a touch. He pushed the blade aside with a finger.
Such courage we can find when we need it, huh? Fortunately, vengeance will suffice. My master's influence has not consumed me wholly. Not yet, anyway. I'll have my vengeance in proper fashion.
And the creature gestured for Louis to take his seat again. Trembling with fury, he laid down his sword and sat back down. Even in wrath and righteous anger, he knew he could not best this thing. Guile's best chance of survival was to parley with the monster. The black lidless eyes now stared directly into his own.
Here's my proposition, Knight of the Red Stallion. Give your gold and silver to the boy. An inheritance. My final act of charity and compassion. Send him away. Take the day to bury your huntsman and the old woman. Fix that shit you call armor. Sharpen that dull sword of yours. Then I will return tomorrow evening. I'll meet you in your courtyard. We'll have our duel beneath the moonlight, just like in the stories and fables of old, where I will extract my vengeance for your failures. That is my best and only offer to you, Sir Louis. My vengeance. Should you prove me wrong, that you are indeed a coward, then I will run your grandson to ground. I will savage him like a starving dog. He will die screaming, calling out for you, my justice.
The hideous thing opened its hands, its palms held open.
So what will it be, sir? Vengeance or justice?
Louis looked at the table where now Agatha's blood dripped in a steady stream. He turned his eyes down and gazed into the blank, pale face of Bard. Louis took his sword and sheathed it.
I think vengeance will suit us both just fine.